Good day, everyone. My name is Kathleen Carley. I'm a division manager in the County of San Luis Obispo's Public Health Department. Welcome to our four-part webinar series, Communicating Climate Change as a Public Health Issue. We have over 300 people registered today from all over the country and world, actually, from Hawaii to the Baylor College of Medicine to the Vermont Department of Health and the University of Cape Town. A few acknowledgments before we start. This webinar series received funding from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the California Department of Public Health Office of Health Equity. Its contents are solely the responsibility of the presenters and do not necessarily represent the official views of the CDC or the Office of Health Equity. Many thanks to Dorette English at the California Department of Public Health for her support in getting this series organized. To our staff members, Morgan Feld and Tara Kennan, for handling all of the details and making this event possible. And to Stephen Hughes and Frank Gonzalez at Showtell Productions for their technical expertise. This series is being recorded and will be posted on our website, www.healslow.com. You will receive an email evaluation after the series is complete. If you are one of the people requesting continuing education units, you will need to complete the evaluation before the units are sent to you. All participants will remain on mute to prevent auditory feedback. The question and answer function will be active and we will monitor it, and we will answer questions as time permits at the end of the presentation. And now it is my pleasure to introduce my boss, Dr. Penny Borenstein, who is the health officer for San Luis Obispo County.
Good morning, everyone. I am so thrilled to be here with you, and I especially like the title of this series, Communicating Climate Change as a Public Health Issue. I have told some of my staff that I am constantly, those of you in public health know, explaining what public health is. And more to the point of late, people ask me, so what are the hot issues? What are the big public health issues in your community, in small San Luis Obispo County, and generally? And when I tell them that climate change is among my top three and is perhaps the most pressing public health issue, I get these quizzical looks, as if that's the terrain of environmentalists and planners and public works folks and scientists, etc. Well, your being here with me today is evidence that that perception is hopefully changing. And while we're not going to get into the heavy science of the negative effects of climate change, we certainly are going to touch on how it is currently affecting and expected to affect increasingly the public's health as we progress in our climate change. So I am thrilled that our small health department here on the Central Coast is getting the opportunity to host this webinar series. I hope that you will all tune in for all four and be with us on the next 3 Wednesday mornings as well. We have for you in this series a number of both knowledge brokers and scientists, as well as we'll be presenting on the ground practical real life examples of what can be done in an effort to adapt and mitigate to climate change. As an example of that, in the 4th series, I'd be remiss if I didn't highlight our own local efforts. About 3 years ago, we started a campaign called Outside In Slow, which is really a community awareness campaign to teach the public how you can both do things that are good for your individual health and at the same time be addressing the effects of climate change. And as I said, you'll hear more about that at our 4th series, the end series on this issue. We are a small area. Our population is about 300,000, 280. And given that, you would think there's not much we can do. We certainly have brethren who we work with in the Bay Area and San Francisco, Alameda, Los Angeles, who are doing some tremendous things. But I hope that there are many of you who are from smaller communities who can take away from these webinar series the fact that small communities like ours that has a full range of urban, rural, remote communities and environments, and a full spectrum of demographics, are just as vulnerable, given that we live on the coast and have, as I said, the full range of population for whom public health is going to be affected related to climate change. I want to say one more thing about our community. For those of you who don't know, First Five California is an effort that was passed by the voters, a tobacco tax, more than 10 years ago, coming up actually on 20 years. And it is an effort to address the needs of children and to put a laser focus on birth to 5, thus the name First Five. And I am sitting in the offices of our First Five chapter in San Luis Obispo, and they have taken the advocacy position to be out front as a thought leader and a change leader on the issue of climate change, and have recently passed a position statement saying that we will, as a community, work vigorously and diligently to address the effects of climate change for our most vulnerable young population. So kudos to First Five, and thank you for being with us. I also now have the great pleasure of introducing our speaker, Susan Joy Hassel. So hang on to your seats. I will try to be somewhat brief, but she is certainly a champion in this arena and has a lengthy bio, and I will give you many of the highlights. So when our staff was first in contact with her, she was whizzing off to consult at the IPCC, or International Panel on Climate Change. Susan Joy Hassel is a climate change communicator, analyst, and author known for her ability to translate science into English, making complex issues accessible to policymakers and the public, and has done so for more than 2 decades. She's the senior science writer on all 3 national climate assessments and has written authoritative reports in plain English to better inform policymakers and the public about climate change and its effects on our nation. In 2012, Susan was elected as a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science for her, quote, exceptional contributions in the area of science communication, particularly for communication of the science of climate change to policymakers and the public. In 2006, she received the Climate Institute's first ever award for excellence in climate science communication, and she currently serves as a communication advisor to the World Meteorological Organization's Commission for Climatology. She has served 2 terms on the board of directors of the American Geophysical Union and has been a visiting scholar at NOAA's National Climate Data Center. She publishes widely on climate science, communication, solutions, and policy, and among her most recent publications, February 2017, was a Scientific American commentary entitled Climate Trumps Everything, also written with Dr. Mann. Lastly, Susan has discussed climate change on many national stages, including radio and television shows, ABC's 2020, Frontline, and now on PBS. She has been seen on ABC's News Global Warming and Planet Earth, and has addressed influential groups such as the U.S. Conference of Mayors and the U.S. Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. So with that, I look forward to hearing from Susan Joy Hassel, and thank you all for being with us.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so glad that I could be here with you. We're going to talk a little bit today about telling the climate change story. My website is here, climatecommunication.org. My Twitter handle is @climatecomms, 2 M's, and we're just going to jump right into this. Thank you very much for the nice introduction. Thank you all for being here. I thought I would just give you a quick taste of some of the things that I've done in this 25 plus years that I've been working on communicating the science of climate change and solutions. The Arctic Climate Impact Assessment was one of the really exceptional projects that I've worked on. I authored the synthesis report called Impacts of a Warming Arctic. As was mentioned, I worked as a senior science writer on all 3 national climate assessments, including the most recent one. I gave a TEDx talk, which you can all see. Probably the easiest way to get to it is to go to my website, climatecommunication.org, and there's a link there that takes you to the YouTube video of that talk. I wrote the HBO documentary, Too Hot Not to Handle. And one of the things I'm most proud of is something that you see pictured here. I've worked with hundreds and hundreds of climate scientists and other messengers on how to communicate more effectively. I work with them sometimes one-on-one when the need arises. But in this case, I was leading a workshop on effective communication of climate change. So with that, I want to jump right into talking about telling the climate change story. And I'll start by saying that I've got both good news and bad news for you. So let's start with a little good news. Americans' views on global warming are moving in the right direction. You can see here that the percentage of Americans who say most scientists believe global warming is occurring is now at 71%. That's high. This is all recent Gallup poll data from March of 2017. Percentage of Americans who believe global warming is caused by human activities is up to 68%. Now, of course, these numbers should be even higher, but they're going up. And so they're trending in the right direction. We're grateful for that. Believe the effects have already begun, up to 62%, and those worrying a great deal, up to 45%. So this is really good news. Now, I don't think I have to tell any of you that there's also some bad news. And it won't be a surprise to anyone to know that we're living in a time when some of the basic facts of climate science are being questioned, when the US has stated its desire to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement, that climate change is being dropped from government reviews of impacts, and that we're seeing a reversal of a lot of policies at the federal level. So this is very distressing. We also know we have a big partisan gap on this issue, which I'm going to talk more about. So what do we do? How do we proceed in the face of this really extraordinary existential threat to humanity and other life on Earth, and the really tremendous political and social and psychological challenges that we face in communicating it? Well, there are a number of things we can do. Some things about communicating climate change are really unique to climate change, and others are true for communicating anything. One of the first steps in good communication is connecting on values, because people will trust and listen to what you have to say if you share values. So what you want to do is look for common ground. You can always find something that you agree on with people, and if you work from there, I think you have a much better chance of success in whatever you're trying to communicate. And this is very true with climate change. You also need to engage trusted voices, because often as important as your message is who is your messenger. Is it a voice that people trust? And of course, different audiences have different trusted voices. Make it personal. As long as people think of climate change as a distant threat, distant in time, something that's maybe just for the future, or distant in space, something that's going to affect polar bears in the Arctic or people on Pacific islands, then they're not really going to relate to it. But it's very important to make it personal for people. We need to change the narrative, and I'm going to talk quite a bit more about that as we go forward. There's a narrative around climate change that it's a political issue, that it's about saving the Earth, that it's a problem for the future, that if you're a Republican, you don't accept it. All of those things really need to change. And we need to have the conversation. We have a spiral of silence around climate change. In general, people don't talk very much about it. One of the reasons they don't talk about it is they fear that other people don't share their views. And they also don't feel very confident in what they know. And the reason it's a downward spiral is because if you don't talk about it, you don't learn what the people around you think, and you don't learn more and become more confident. So having the conversation is extremely important, and having more media coverage of climate change is important, and having the conversation in the public health context is important. And we're going to talk a lot more about that today. So the piece was mentioned, Climate Trumps Everything. You can download the piece as a PDF at my website, climatecommunication.org, under resources and under articles. You'll see the whole thing there. What we did right after the election, and it says published in 2016 and 2017 because we wrote it the day after the election. and it was posted online within a couple of days of the election in 2016. Then it was also published in the hard copy of the magazine in 2017. What we tried to do in this piece is everything that I just mentioned on the last slide. We connected on values, we looked for common ground, and we said, you know, if this new administration really wants to do all the things it says it wants to do, making America great and all that, we would take action on climate change because it would create jobs, grow the economy, help us compete in the global clean energy race. It would help us lead the world and retain our international respect in the global arena. It will make our businesses more efficient and more profitable. It'll keep our air and water clean, keep our children safe and healthy. It would make the climate great again and make America great again. So we really tried to make all of those arguments. Unfortunately, they weren't taken up by the current administration, although we did reach out. But this is important and to the kinds of things that I'm talking about. And when you read this piece, it's only one page. Feel free to download it and take a look. It's the kind of thing that I'm emphasizing might be worthwhile when you're talking to people, especially talking to people who aren't likely to accept the science of climate change right off the bat. Now, we're going to talk today a lot about the climate health connection. As all of you probably know, climate change is a health issue, a human health issue, a public health issue. We want to make it personal and relevant. And health is relevant to everyone, so it's obviously a really good way to do that. You want to engage trusted voices. That includes people's physicians, their public health professionals, and others. You need to know your audience because different audiences will respond to different kinds of messages and to different health concerns related to climate change. We'll talk more about that. Now, my colleague Ed Maybeck at George Mason University says that the secret of all good communication boils down to this: simple, clear messages, repeated often by a variety of trusted voices. And I could not agree more. That's really what it comes down to. So we tend to overwhelm people, I think, sometimes with too much information, too much detail, too much complexity. Simple, clear messages. And we need to repeat them so often in many different ways, and they need to hear it from lots of different sources that they trust. So, on this subject, there is a new consortium of a dozen medical societies that have taken up the topic of climate change as a public health issue. And this is a news article that was about the release of the report that they put out, launching their organization and announcing their first report. This is what that report looks like. You can download it again from my website, climatecommunication.org, under resources and under reports. And you will see this medical alert: climate change is harming our health, from this new medical society consortium on climate and health. This is really important because they have done all the things I just mentioned. They've engaged the medical community, these trusted voices, in talking to their patients about climate change. Now, this report that they did is really a great example of how to do good communication about climate change and health. And so I'm going to walk through a little bit of it because I think they did such a great job. Now, what they did was they took much of this information from a US national assessment of climate change and health. That assessment, very good science, not so easy to understand for the average person. So, pretty technical, pretty long. What they did in this report, and I actually helped a little bit, was to really bring it down to a level that everyone can understand. And they broke it down by region. They talked about 8 different ways that climate change affects our health. And you can see all this in this report, which you can download at the website. And one of the things I helped with was taking all of that technical information from the US Climate and Health Assessment and putting it into some very brief, very clear terms. So for example, on extreme heat, for each of these 8 things, we said, what's happening to climate in this arena? How is it harming our health? And who is most vulnerable to that? And so in this report, you see a page like this for each of those 8 ways that climate change is affecting our health. And then, very importantly, you see a personal story. Because, you know, one death, you've probably heard this, one death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. You think, well, a million deaths, that's way worse than one death. But when you're communicating, seeing the face of one person and hearing about the death of one person or the illness of one person is actually a more effective communication technique for the public. And you know, groups that raise money, they know this. That's why you always see the face of one child. You don't see a sea of children. And this is very important. In each of these cases, you see a personal story. You also see the faces of the people who have experienced this, and you hear from particular doctors who have treated particular people. Here's another one of these, air pollution. Again, what's happening to climate? How is that harming our health? And who is being harmed? Who's most vulnerable? And you see individual stories from doctors and of particular people. Same thing with ticks and mosquito-borne disease. What's happening, how it's affecting our health, and who's most vulnerable. Again, a personal story. I think you'll find this report very useful, both for its information and for examples of how to communicate this information in ways that will really be effective to people. Now, this I just had to show you. Some of you have probably heard of the Lone Star tick and the fact that it carries a disease that makes people allergic to a protein, alpha-gal, that makes you allergic to red meat. So I was doing some reading about this online, and I go to this article, and this is a screenshot. I kid you not. The ad at the top was attached to this story about the meat allergy, and it's an ad for beef. And I thought it was really funny. I wondered if maybe the way that they do these ads is if a story mentions beef, they show the ad up there. Anyway, here it is. And this is just one of the, this is just one of the health impacts that is carried by ticks. So they went on to talk about extreme weather. And again, the same breakdown. And this is where I helped. I helped to write these short, clear pieces on each of the 8 ways that climate change is affecting our health. And again, personal story, pictures, doctors, real people experiencing these impacts. Now, on the subject of extreme weather, I thought I would tell you a little bit more about that. I recently published an article in the World Meteorological Organization Bulletin, which is a journal of the WMO, and I was the lead author on this piece that talks about communicating the linkages between extreme weather events and climate change. And I call it unnatural disasters. This is really important because this is only going to matter to people if they connect the dots, if they understand that many types of extreme weather are in fact increasing because of climate change. Now, the science on these linkages has really moved ahead quite a bit in the last few years. So some people are still stuck on the old science, and they say things like, well, we can't attribute any particular extreme weather event to climate change. Well, that is no longer true. We actually can attribute particular weather events. We can say how much more likely they've become because of climate change. You know, for example, that heat wave that killed tens of thousands of people in Europe some years ago, the analysis of that heat wave shows that it was made at least 4 times more likely because of human-induced climate change. So that's a specific attribution statement that we can make. We know that we're seeing more of some types of extreme weather events. And you can again download this article at my website under resources and articles, and you can download the whole thing. Now, I'll just give you a little summary of some of the tips that we recommend in that article for communicating the linkages between extreme weather and climate change. One thing is to lead with what we know. So instead of saying what I said before, well, we can't attribute, you want to say what we can say and what we do know. For example, we know that in a warmer world, as average temperatures increase, extreme high temperatures increase, and they increase even more than the average. And that gives us the problems with extreme heat. You also want to simply explain the mechanism. Now, the one with heat is pretty obvious. There's another one with heavy downpours that cause flooding. And the mechanism there is this: when a warmer atmosphere can actually hold more moisture. And so because the air is getting warmer, it holds more moisture. And then when a given storm system comes through, it dumps out in a heavy downpour, and that can lead to flooding. By simply explaining that mechanism to people, it really helps them to hold on to it and realize what's going on. And also with regard to drought, it's not just a reduction in precipitation, it's the fact that the higher air temperature evaporates more moisture out of the soil. And so you can have a cycle of floods and droughts because of these two mechanisms that I've mentioned. So it's helpful for people to understand those things if you explain them very simply. Metaphors are really helpful in this arena. So for example, we can say by loading the atmosphere with these heat-trapping gases, we're loading the dice towards more rolls of extreme weather events, more rolls of the double sixes, if you will. We can also use the metaphor of steroids. You know, when an athlete, before the athlete, say a baseball player, was using steroids, well, that athlete still hit home runs. Once he started using steroids, he hit more home runs and he hit them farther. What we're doing now, this is the climate and the weather on steroids. By adding these heat-trapping gases to the atmosphere, we're putting the weather on steroids. So sure, there have always been extreme weather events, but now what we're seeing more of them, and they're more intense, and they're harming us more. So that's a kind of metaphor that can be really helpful and help people wrap their minds around how climate change is affecting certain types of extreme weather events. Now, it's also useful to restate the basic facts of climate change, because a lot of people don't even understand the most basic mechanism. They don't realize that climate change, what's causing climate change, that it's caused by the buildup of carbon dioxide, methane, and these other heat-trapping gases. So instead of saying greenhouse gases, I say heat-trapping gases, because it reinforces the mechanism. These gases are trapping heat, making the earth warmer, changing our climate. So, you know, I like to say that the basics of climate change are basically 5 things. It's warming, it's us, it's bad, experts agree, and there's hope. And I'm sure all of you understand that. We know the world is warming. We know that for sure. We know humans are the dominant cause. We know that its impacts are already happening and are not having a lot of negative effects on us, that experts agree, and that there's a lot we can do, both to respond to the impacts and adapt, and also to reduce emissions that are causing climate change. It's useful to reframe a poorly posed question. If someone says, this heat wave, was it caused by global warming? Well, the short answer, you know, it's difficult to give the short answer. So the better thing to do is to reframe the question and to say, yes, global warming is affecting our weather. It is affecting heat waves. It's making heat waves like this one more common. And if there's been an attribution study, you can say, in fact, this heat wave was made 10 times more likely because of human-induced climate change. But even if you can't say that, you can say, this is the kind of thing we're seeing more of now, and that we're going to see a lot more of in the future if we continue on the current course of increasing emissions. So you reframe the poorly posed question and you answer it. And this is not the same as dodging a question. It's simply expressing it in a more effective and helpful way. And I think it's also useful to consider avoiding language that leads entirely to despair, right? We want people to understand the seriousness of the threat of climate change, the impacts we're already seeing, and how bad it really can get if we do nothing about it, if we continue on our current course. But we also want them to understand that there's a lot we can do about it, both to reduce future climate change and to adapt to some of the impacts that we're already seeing. So it's important not to leave people feeling that this is inevitable and there's nothing we can do about it, because that's not accurate. So I want to come to this issue that I mentioned earlier, because it's really very, very important, and that is the partisan divide on climate change. It's frustrating, and it shouldn't be the case. This should not be a partisan issue, but it is. And it's increasingly partisan, and that's really distressing. It was not always as partisan as it is now. And I want to show you some information on that subject from Gallup poll. So if you look at this, these are the percentage of respondents saying that they personally worry a great deal about global warming. And in blue is Democrats, in red is Republicans, and black is the total public. Now, what you'll see is, not surprisingly, because we all know this has become such a partisan issue, that Democrats worry more about global warming and Republicans worry less. But beyond that, what you can see here is that the partisan gap has increased. As we've learned more about climate change and about how worrisome it really is, Democrats have become more concerned over time. Republicans have become less concerned over time. So the partisan gap has grown. This is very troubling to me. Here's another one. People who are saying, of the percentage of the public who accept and understand that the changes we're seeing are due to human activity by party. So again, among the Democrats, what you can see is that as the evidence has become stronger over time, they have become more convinced. It used to be 70%, now it's 84%. And among Republicans, it's the opposite. It used to be 53%, now it's down to 43%. And you may wonder why this is. You may wonder, could it be that the Democrats are more educated, that they're more scientifically literate? And both of those would be wrong. Has nothing to do with education level or scientific literacy. Both of those have been tested. And what we found, fascinatingly, is that among Democrats, if you're a Democrat, the more education you have and the more scientifically literate you are, the more likely you are to be concerned about climate change and to accept the science. And if you're a Republican, it's the opposite. The more scientifically literate and the more education you have as a Republican, the less likely you are to be concerned about climate change. Now, why in the world would that be? It seems so crazy, but it's true, and it's because of some things that I want to talk about. It's not about the science. It's about identity. It's about tribalism. It's about the elite cues that people get from their leaders and what their leaders say. And it's about motivated reasoning. So I said, if you're a Republican, with higher education, you're less likely to be concerned about climate change. That's because you have more tools at your disposal. You're more scientifically literate. You have more education. You can find the information that supports the position that you believe is right for your group, your tribal identity, and so you're able to do that motivated reasoning better. Now, another reason is solution aversion. I talk a lot about this in my TED Talk, so if you're interested in this or any of these issues, go watch that. It's about 15 minutes and it covers a lot of ground. What solution aversion means is that if you are of the political persuasion that does not like regulation, restriction, cuts, conserve, tax, all those kinds of things, then you're averse to what you think the solutions to climate change are. But the solutions to climate change don't have to be about that. They can be about entrepreneurship and competing in the global clean energy economy and all kinds of other things. And so I talk about this in my TED Talk because I talk about the fact that the language we use really matters a lot and can avoid some of the problems with solution aversion. Now, all of these things mean that the partisan polarization is highly resistant to change. And this is worrisome because we need to change it. We need to get everybody on board. So what are some possible remedies? How do we move ahead with this kind of thing? Well, one thing we can do is add other reasons for concern. People have tended to categorize climate change as an environmental issue, which means if you're not an environmentalist, it's not your issue, it's not for you. But if we talk about concerns like public health and our own personal health, well, that's another reason for concern. It's not about the polar bears, it's about us, or it's about both, of course. So by adding these other reasons for concern, health, national security, the economy, all of those kinds of things. Another thing we can do is shift the focus, especially when we're talking to people that we know are particularly averse to hearing about climate change. Instead of banging our head against a locked front door, what we can do is look for a side door. And the side door is sometimes shifting a focus to the other benefits of the same kinds of solutions. For example, clean energy. Clean energy has lots of other benefits. in terms of economic growth and job creation and clean air and so forth. So maybe with some people, talking about climate change right off the bat is not the best way in. So as an example of that, here's a percentage. Just look at this map for a second. This comes from our friends at Yale, who have downscaled national data to the level of counties in this case. And this is the percentage of adults who think global warming is mostly caused by human activities. So if you look at the scale on the right, you can see that everything in blue is less than 50%. And you can see that over a lot of this country, less than half of the people believe that human activities are the dominant cause of climate change. So that would make you feel a little bit concerned about how to begin to talk about climate change in that way. However, look at this. Here's the percentage who support research into renewable energy. Wow, it's almost everybody. Even people who do not believe humans are causing climate change, they still like renewable energy. They probably like it for other reasons, having nothing to do with climate change. So this gives us a side door. Remember I said if your front door is locked, you might want to look for a side door. Here's one of the side doors. Because you know what? The atmosphere doesn't really care what you believe. It cares what your emissions are. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. So Nancy Jackson runs the Climate and Energy Project in Kansas. And where she lives and where she works, most people don't accept the science of climate change. So she doesn't even talk about climate change right off the bat. She talks about the benefits of energy efficiency and clean energy. They have a lot of fun. Schools compete against each other to see who can save the most energy. Every holiday they do something different. So on Valentine's Day, they shut off all the lights and they eat by candlelight. On Halloween, they have the vampire contest to see who can reduce their vampire loads of electricity. You know what those are. Those are the things that are sucking energy even when they're not in use, just because they're still plugged in. And so they make it fun and they make it a competition, and they're saving money. They're keeping more dollars in their community. They're keeping their air cleaner. They're creating jobs, and they're not doing it because of climate change. And the atmosphere doesn't care why you're doing it, just that you do it. And so she's getting emissions cut, and she's not talking about climate change. Now, eventually you do want to get around to talking about it, but it doesn't have to be the first thing out of your mouth. And there's another example of this kind of thing and about seeking common ground, like I talked about. So here are two women you would think would probably have very little in common. Debbie Dooley is the founder of the Georgia Tea Party. Colleen Kiernan, she's the head of the Georgia Sierra Club. But what these two women do have in common, they both love solar energy. Debbie Dooley, they like it for different reasons. Debbie Dooley likes it because she thinks that you should be able to put solar panels on your roof if you want. The utility shouldn't be able to stop you. The state shouldn't be able to tell you what to do. And you should be able to sell that power back to the utility and make good money doing it. Colleen Kiernan likes it because it's doing something good for the environment. It's reducing emissions. So they were able to work together in the state of Georgia to try and get better laws that are more supportive of solar energy. So you can form these coalitions that may seem like strange bedfellows. In this case, the Tea Party and the Greens, they made the Green Tea Coalition. It's a great idea. We can find common ground. And there's evidence that to promote, was in Nature Climate Change, that to promote pro-environmental actions in people who don't accept the science of climate change, the best way to do that is to motivate them with other benefits, because there are other benefits. You've probably heard the term co-benefits. I don't use that term because it's jargon and people don't know what it means. To me, it sounds like something to do with health insurance, maybe. So multiple benefits of action proven in the study I just showed you, Bain et al., done all over the world. These other benefits motivate people whether or not they accept the science of climate change. So clean air, economic development, scientific advancement, job creation, healthier communities, personal health, right? Riding a bike and walking, better for the environment, better for you. All of these motivate people. So when you're dealing with an audience that's very resistant to the science of climate change, talk about these other benefits, and you'll find that you might make progress. And once you establish trust, then down the road, you might get a chance to also talk about climate change being yet another reason to take these same kinds of actions on clean energy and some of the other things. Here's a great example. The Kentucky Coal Museum, just this year, covered its roof with solar panels. Why? Not because of climate change, but because it saved them $8,000 a year on their energy costs. So if the Kentucky Coal Museum is doing that, there's a great example of people doing things for different reasons, but helping climate at the same time. Republican governors are warming to renewables, and it's not about climate change for the most part. It's about jobs, economic growth, and saving money. And we're seeing more and more of this. So just a communication tip. Now, I've been talking a lot about the partisan gap. I want to tell you just a couple of other interesting things about what we understand about the psychology of liberals and conservatives and how that might help you when you're addressing particular audiences. Now, the environment, it turns out, is a moral issue for both liberals and conservatives, but the nature of that issue is slightly different. So for liberals, it tends to be about sustainability and harm or care of the environment. And so the kinds of images that are most repellent are images that show the destruction of nature. For conservatives, it's also a moral issue, but in this case, it's more about purity, pure air, clean water, the sanctity, patriotism, reverence for higher authority. That's a little bit different angle. And so the most repellent images are human-oriented, smoggy air, dirty water. So this is helpful if you're talking to a particular audience or a particular person even, maybe it's a policymaker, and you can tune your message for that audience. Another difference that's been found, and both of these are out of research studies that are referenced on the bottom there, for liberals, they tend to be more about progress and have more of a future focus, and they want to avoid a less desirable future. For conservatives, it's a little more about nostalgia. It's about invoking a past standard and returning to a more desirable past. So this is the way it used to be. We want to return to that. Make the climate great again, right? That's why the message, Make America Great Again, resonated so much with conservatives, because there's this nostalgia for the way things were. And so we can use that in the way we talk about climate change. Now, I am a big believer that words matter. And I'm going to give you just a couple of examples. Sometimes I hear people say, the world is warming and we're to blame. It's our fault. I never use the words blame or fault. They're very negative words, and they can actually put people on the defensive and make them want to say, no, I didn't do it on purpose. It's not my fault. So instead, I say it's our responsibility, because responsibility is a positive thing. It has positive connotations. This is about what kind of people are we? Do we take responsibility for our actions? Do we clean up our own mess? So the world's warming, we're the cause, it's our responsibility. That's different. Also, when we talk about future climate change, I never talk about, well, it's inevitable. Of course, I know that there is an additional amount of climate change that is already in the pipeline because of the emissions that we've already put into the atmosphere. I also know that there are lags in the climate system, and once we heat up the oceans, they're going to continue to rise for quite some time. However, we face a choice between a little more warming and a lot more warming, between a little more sea level rise and a lot more sea level rise. And so the choice we face is a much better way to talk about this than the inevitability of certain things. And because every day we continue down the same path, we commit more and more of the future to more and more change, it's urgent that we act now. So the words I use when talking about the future are to emphasize choice and urgency. Now, I also avoid saying that I believe in climate change, because it's not about belief, it's about evidence. It's not something you can believe in or not believe in. And something Neil deGrasse Tyson said, science is true whether you believe it or not. So it's not about believing in climate change. So whenever people ask me if I believe in climate change, I say, I don't really believe in it. We measure it. I know it's true. I know the evidence, but but it's not about belief. And so from that, when people say, well, what's the best way to talk about the scientific consensus on climate change? My colleagues, Ed Maybach, that I mentioned at George Mason, and Tony Leiserowitz at Yale, tested what's the best language to use to communicate the scientific consensus. And they tried a bunch of different things. And this turned out to be the best way to communicate it. It's not about belief. It's not about consensus, which sounds like it might be about opinion. It's this. Based on the evidence, 97% of climate scientists have concluded that human-caused climate change is happening. It's simple, it's straightforward, and it was very effective at communicating to people the tremendous scientific agreement based on evidence that there is around human-induced climate change. And also they found that a pie chart, like the one you see here, is a very effective way to communicate what we know about the scientific consensus on climate change. Now here's some more on in the words matter idea. It's not just about saving the earth. I often hear people say, this is about, we got to save the earth. Well, the earth is going to continue to be here. This is really more about saving ourselves. So it's not just about the planet. It's not about the environment. Like I said, then it's just an environmental issue. And if you're not an environmentalist, it's not your issue. And it's not just about polar bears. It's about us. It's about people. It's about our economy, our way of life. It's about food and water and our health and everything we care about and leaving a better world for our children. So I think it's very important that we frame this properly and don't make it an environmental issue only. Another thing that's very important is to bring it close to home. When Americans are asked to visualize an image of climate change, the most common image they come up with is melting ice at the poles and polar bears. But it's not just about that. It's about agriculture and drought and fires, a longer fire season, and the fact that our Forest Service now spends so much of its budget fighting fires that they don't have the money to do other things that we care about. It's about flooding from heavy downpours. All of these things are close to home and they're affecting us. And they're affecting us in every region of the country and in just about every sector of our economy. And these are the stories we need to tell and the images we need to use. Now, I keep talking about words, and this is another way that words matter. And this is one of my pet peeves. It's something I've been thinking about and talking about and writing about, publishing about for decades. I talk about it in my TED Talk if you want to watch that. These are words that mean entirely different things to scientists and other experts than they do to the public. And these words are even more dangerous than jargon, because jargon's just a big word they don't understand. These are words they do understand, they just understand them to mean something entirely different. So a good example of that is aerosol. Now, as public health people, you're probably used to talking about aerosols, these small particles in the atmosphere, but to the public, an aerosol is a spray can, and that's what it's always going to be. So this is a picture of Rush Limbaugh. He heard from scientists that aerosols were cooling the climate. Of course, what they were talking about was the sulfate aerosols, the sulfate particles from coal burning, for example, that do have a cooling influence and offset some of the warming from carbon dioxide, methane, and the other heat-trapping gases. So here he is, he's doing his part for global warming by spraying aerosols on the globe. So I just say tiny particles when you're talking to the public, or dust or something, but try and avoid this word that will confuse people. Here's another good one, positive feedback. So for the public, positive feedback is a good thing, right? You do a good job at work, you get positive feedback. But in the climate system, a positive feedback is a vicious cycle whereby warming causes even more warming. So just say vicious cycle or self-reinforcing cycle or something like that. So I published an article with my colleague Richard Somerville in Physics Today. We put some of these scientific terms. Again, you can download this article at my website, so don't feel like you need to read all of this real quick or memorize it or write it down. Just go to my website, download the article. It's there, it's free. And you can have this table for your very own. You can pin it up in your office if you like. I actually have expanded this list to many more words. But you'll notice that there's one word here, theory. This is one that I think is really interesting because people who are, trying to convince people that, global warming isn't real, they'll say, well, it's just a theory. And that's because to the public, it's just, a hunch or speculation. It's not, the kind of very well established thing, like the theory of gravity, right? In science, a theory is something that's very well established. So whenever I hear them say, well, global warming's only a theory, I always say, well, gravity, it's only a theory too. And another one of those words that you will have noticed was the word error. So scientists often talk about error bars as, the difference between, the range around a particular measurement, right? They call those error bars. So I think when I retire, I'm going to open up a tavern for scientists. I'm going to call it the error bar. Now, I have expanded my list. I've got over 150 of these words. Here are some of them. And I just, as I say, I think these words are very dangerous because people know what they mean. They just mean something completely different. So let me move on and mention one other thing before I head into the final stretch of what I want to tell you. And that is this. So, those customer loyalty cards, you go to a car wash, you get 8 car washes and you get the 8 punches and you get 1 free, right? So in this experiment, half the people got that card. The other people got a card where they had to get 10 punches, but they gave you a head start by giving you 2 free ones to start you off. Now, of course, anybody here who can do higher math knows that both had the same goal. Both had to get 8 car washes to get the free car wash. But look what happened. The people who thought they were starting from scratch, fewer of them reached their goal and got the free car wash. The ones who thought they got a head start, even though it was really the same thing, 34% of them reached the goal and they got there faster. And so what this tells us is that people are more motivated to act if they feel like we're already on our way, rather than if they feel like we're starting from scratch. So when I talk about the changes that we have to make in order to address climate change, I don't say we have to remake the entire world's energy system from scratch. No, I say we're already on our way. More than something like 70% of the new electricity that came online in the last couple of years in the United States has been renewable energy. We are moving, we are on our way. It doesn't mean we're doing enough. We have to do more, we have to do it faster, and we have to work together to make that happen. But we're not starting from scratch. And so in that vein, what I'd like to do is give you the top 10 reasons for hope on climate change. Because, there's a lot of reason to be discouraged right now, especially with the kind of action we're seeing at the federal level. However, there are lots of good reasons for hope. So let's count down from 10. Number 10, cities and states are doing a lot. Your state of California is doing a lot. 75% of emissions come from cities. 12 states and 300 cities are committed. There's Michael Bloomberg and Governor Jerry Brown are leading an effort by states and cities and corporations and universities and investors, and they're adding up the commitments from all of those entities, those subnational entities, in something they call America's Pledge. And what they're going to try and see is, can those pledges come together to be as much as the US's pledge was to the Paris Agreement, 26 to 28% reductions. So lots of things are happening. There are regional initiatives, like in the northeastern US, there's the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, where a group of states has come together. The western states and Canadian provinces have come together. This is a real reason for hope. There's a lot of good stuff happening out there. Businesses are also really moving, and not just small, crunchy granola type businesses, big businesses, Nike, Goldman Sachs, IKEA, all the ones that you see listed here. All of these businesses have pledged to move to 100% renewable energy. So they're really moving on this. Number 8, even some of the largest oil and gas companies in the world have called for a price on carbon. And what that would do is send a price signal to the economy that we should be reducing our emissions and, moving in the direction of clean energy. So this is impressive. Number 7, the Francis effect. I'm sure you've all heard about Pope Francis and his encyclical and the fact that he's helping people to see that climate change is a moral issue. It's about taking care of the least of these. It's about taking care of our children and doing the right thing in the world. It's about creation care. if you're a religious person, taking care of God's creation. Number 6, coal use is declining globally. This is important because coal puts out the most carbon dioxide per unit of energy of all the fossil fuels that we use to produce energy. So you can see this. It's from Bloomberg, and actually the source is the BP, that is British Petroleum. They like to now say Beyond Petroleum, Statistical Review of World Energy. And you can see a big decline, particularly in recent years, in coal production. So this is good. Number 5, global engagement. In the US's recent decision to try and pull themselves out of the Paris Agreement, it is in effect globally. Nearly 200 countries are signed on and are working hard and are not deterred by the fact that one country has now pulled out. In fact, it may have even bumped up some emerging leadership. China has stepped up its efforts on climate change in the wake of the US pulling out of Paris. India is launching a massive push to move in the direction of clean energy. Europe is really moving forward. I mentioned that 70% of new power in the US has come from clean energy. In Europe, it's 90%. So really good leadership emerging from other quarters, and that's very hopeful. Number 3, emissions and the economy have finally looks like they are decoupling. And what I mean by that is, since the Industrial Revolution, economic growth and emissions of carbon dioxide have moved up in tandem. For the first time in the last 3 years, emissions have leveled off while the economy has continued to grow. That's very good. That means we're using energy more efficiently and we're using more renewable energy. And if we can continue to decouple emissions from economic growth, that's good for us. And this is data from the International Energy Agency. And this is more of what that looks like in the US. So here's the US decoupling. The blue is our gross domestic product, and the red is our carbon dioxide emissions from energy. So you can see that our economy has been growing and our CO2 emissions from energy have been declining. That's very good news. Number 2, the cost of solar and wind are falling really fast, faster than anyone could have predicted. And you can see that here. And not surprisingly, as a result of those falling costs, we've seen a big increase in solar installations in the US and globally. This is in the US. And the same exact thing is true of wind. The price has fallen very rapidly and the installations have increased very rapidly. And so what all that means is that a clean energy future actually costs less than a dirty one. So just since 2008, the cost of solar is down 80%. The cost of wind is down 50% because it had already fallen a lot even by 2008. The cost of batteries is down 70% and continuing to fall. And the cost of light emitting diodes, LEDs, those super efficient light bulbs, is down 90%. So this is all really great news. And, I think ultimately the best news is that the future is in our hands. If this were caused by something other than our activities, it was just our being hit by some cosmic bust, there'd be very little we could do about it and there wouldn't be much hope. But the future is in our hands. The choices that we make about our economy, about our energy use, and about what we choose to do to take action on climate change, we can determine the kind of future we have. One with a little more warming that we still have to adapt to and deal with, and one with a lot more warming where it becomes a global catastrophe. So I think that's really the best news, is that the choice is up to us. With that, I'm going to stop and I will be happy to take your questions and have a conversation. So thank you very much for your kind attention.
Okay, we're unmuted.
Well, thank you, Susan, so much. I, for one, am coming away from this with a new enthusiasm and positive energy about climate change. It's not often that I come away from a climate change talk feeling optimistic. So thank you for helping us do that. We do have a few questions queued up, and let me start sharing with you.
Great.
So the first is more of just a housekeeping question. The question is, will recordings be available? And if so, where and for how long? Yes, they will be available at slocounty.ca.gov/health, and for an indeterminate amount of time. One of the next questions is, are the communication strategies for all populations, and do you have any special tips for communicating with youth?
Yeah, it's a great question, and communicating with youth is really important. It's in particular important that they understand the issue, but also that they are not led to despair. Especially for younger children, it's very important not to scare the bejesus out of them. You want to tell them this story in a way that they understand that it's serious, but in a way that doesn't frighten them too much. So that's an interesting challenge. I think one of the best ways to communicate the threat without scaring people too much is to communicate the threat honestly, but also to communicate the opportunities and to do them together, not just to talk about the threat, but to talk about the opportunities. So there's plenty to be concerned about. There's plenty to be worried about. Anyone who understands this issue well is worried and is concerned. But those who understand what can be done about it and what we already are doing about it tend to be less likely to fall into despair and more motivated to act. That doesn't mean that there's no place for a little bit of healthy fear. There is, especially if it's clear and true. We want to be very careful to be accurate about what the science projects, including communicating worst case scenarios, but we also have to communicate the opportunities. For young people, you have to meet them where they are. And so young people these days are on social media. So communicate through social media, through Twitter, through Facebook, through Instagram, I know is more the place. And so also through short videos. There are lots of good videos now out there about climate change. Very short though, because people have short attention spans. But those are always that I would say, and there's some good stuff for educational settings. There's a network called the CLEAN Network. So CLEAN, all capitals. It's a climate literacy education network. And if you go to the website for CLEAN online, so just Google that, CLEAN. It's an organization. It's a coalition kind of a network of educators. There's lots of good information there. Also on my website, climatecommunication.org, there's a place for educational resources, and that includes lots of good things for young people in particular. There are some very nice, for example, there's a resource where somebody translated the very technical IPCC reports, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, into a series of haikus. It's very nice. It's great for kids. There's also the old EPA Climate Change Kids website. And I say the old one because it's been taken down now, or it's been made very hard to find. However, I have a link to an archived version of that. And there's a great set of resources for young people there. There are also a number of video resources and other resources under that educational resources drop down under resources at my website. So those were a few ideas for communicating with young people. We really do need to bring them along on this and give them the energy to do what they can do.
Thanks. I do want to make a correction or an addition to the website where both your audio presentation and the slides will be available. Probably the simplest thing, and we have posted that, but to also say it again here, is www.healslo, HEALSLO, which stands, by the way, for Healthy Eating, Active Living, San Luis Obispo.org. Com. I knew I was going to get that wrong. Thankfully, I have people here. Healslo.com. is where people can find all of this material afterwards. We have someone who is particularly intrigued by your steroids metaphor and wants to get it right. So you can go back and listen to that.
Let me mention one other thing on that score. So the steroids metaphor is really quite a good one, I think, and I've worked with lots of my colleagues on using it. One of my colleagues, Jerry Meal at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, used it a few times and got the folks at his lab, NCAR in Boulder, to make a little video of it. So I have that video posted on my website. If so, at climatecommunication.org, at the resources tab, go to videos, and you'll see this little video of an animated baseball player, and you'll hear the whole metaphor, and you'll hear Jerry Meal's voice explaining it, and they did a nice job with that. So just another resource for the person who's interested in that.
Great, thank you. So our next question is asking for tips of the trade in the current political climate. What avenues would you recommend as effective for moving the messages of climate change and health impacts?
Yeah, so I think that the consortium that I talked about is really taking the right approach in bringing health impacts to people in clear, simple messages that people can really understand, using narrative, using personal stories, because those kinds of things are going to get to, I think they're going to find a way into and beyond some of that partisan gap. Everyone cares about their health. Everyone's concerned when they hear that certain diseases are spreading because the range of certain insects or ticks is spreading. People understand and feel viscerally the impact of extreme heat. They know it's becoming more and more uncomfortable to be outside for long periods of time. There are big increases in kidney disease in some places as people, especially for outdoor workers, as they become dehydrated from the higher temperatures. So I think even in this political climate, one of the things I mentioned is finding common ground. Everyone cares about their health. Everyone feels what those things are about. So I think that talking about the personal stories, the effects that we're seeing now are ways in. And of course, it depends on your audience. And I gave you some tips as I spoke about how to appeal to slightly different audiences with slightly different framings. And that's important. For example, some audiences are particularly concerned about national security. And so, the military, our military, is very concerned about climate change. They call it a threat multiplier. They're very concerned about sea level rise at our naval bases in places like Norfolk, Hampton Roads, Virginia, where sea level rise is threatening, the health of our naval base there. There are all kinds of, there is a concern about the impacts of climate change causing more conflict, because we see as there's greater conflict over water resources and food resources, that can lead to strife. And all of those things, when the world becomes a place of environmental refugees as a result of climate change, that's not good for our safety and our security. So all of, those are just some of the ways that I talk to varied audiences on the issue of climate change, taking it out of the environmental realm, at least for some audiences, and putting it into some of these other realms of security and safety and health, I think can be useful. Now, for environmentalists, it's fine to keep talking about it as an environmental problem. And of course it is an environmental problem. But our economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of our environment. You can't have a healthy economy without a healthy environment. The environment is the resource base on which our economy is based. So I think it's really important for people to understand those linkages. And so talking about them in that way, Thoreau once said, what's the use of a house if you haven't got a decent planet to put it on, right? So what's the use of anything that we do and care about if the climate, the environment is coming down around our ears, if we're running out of water in the Southwest, that's a challenge in the part of the world that many of you live in. So, these big cities from Phoenix to Las Vegas to Tucson, those huge cities in the desert. If we run out of water, what's going to be left there? What's going to be worthwhile? And, most of the water in the West comes from snowpack. And in a warming world, we're seeing a decline in snowpack. And I know you sometimes have a really good year and then people go, oh, we had a good year, everything's okay. The long-term trend is clearly down. And the long-term changes in climate mean changes, atmospheric changes that will cause more drying in the Southwest. And the U.S. National Climate Assessment, which is another great resource that I'd like to point you to, it's linked from my website, it's under reports. The website is nca2014.globalchange.gov. I begged them to try and get a simpler, easier to remember website, but we didn't manage to do that. But you can simply go to my website, under resources and reports, and you'll see the NCA, the National Climate Assessment. Most recent one was in 2014. And you'll see these maps with projections of future precipitation change. And what you can see is that we expect to see a reduction in precipitation in the Southwest. And on top of reduced precipitation, you've got higher air temperatures, which means more evaporation. And so even if precipitation doesn't change, you still get more drought conditions just because of the higher air temperature. So, these are all important things to think about, to talk about, and to help people understand.
Thank you. We have another question tailored to a particular community, and this time the question is, what are the stories in communities of color that speak to the climate movement?
Really great question and really important. The climate justice movement is really moving on this front and helping people to understand that communities of color are in many ways more vulnerable. Certainly things like the air pollution impacts. If you are African American or Hispanic, the chances that you live within a certain number of miles of a coal-fired power plant or an oil refinery are much, much higher than if you're white. And so those communities are more vulnerable to the air pollution impacts. Air pollution gets worse generally with climate change because, all other things being equal, warmer air temperatures mean more smog, more ground level ozone, and other problems that affect our health and our lungs. And this is why we see children of color having higher incidence of asthma, for example. So these are important issues, these are important stories. And in the report that I mentioned to you, you see some of those stories, but take a look online for some of the work in the climate justice and environmental justice movement, and you'll see more and more of those stories, because those risks really are greater and those communities are more vulnerable and at greater risk for the reasons I mentioned, for example, on air pollution, but also because they're often, at least in some cases, lower income communities with less resources with which to adapt. Often maybe without air conditioning to beat the heat, and all kinds of issues around that. So it's an important question, and I hope you'll continue to look for the resources on that. They are out there.
Thanks. I'm going to roll a couple of questions that we have together, which has to do with working internationally. So a couple of folks want to know about partnerships internationally and leveraging others' experiences in similar countries, and how do you communicate in those other countries?
I will admit that most of my experiences in the US, it's been such a big challenge to communicate in this country that I haven't done quite so much in other countries. So I feel like I'm probably not the best person to answer that question. I do know that there are some things that are quite similar from country to country. For example, the research I mentioned on what motivates people, and the fact that even people who don't accept the science of climate change are motivated by all the other benefits of action on clean energy. That was an international study. I think they did these surveys in 33 countries or something like that. And so that would be one thing that I can tell you, is that the multiple benefits of action on climate change is a very good strategy internationally. as well as in the US. I also know that the US, Britain, the UK, and Australia are three of the countries in which climate change denial is are really big issues. And that's led me to think that maybe speaking English is the problem. Only kidding. I think that what happens is some of the largest corporations, which are, have for a long time kept up a very well-funded, well-executed disinformation campaign on climate change, are perhaps more active in the US, the UK, and Australia. And that's why we see more of the denial, because of the active disinformation campaign. I didn't talk much about that, but it's very, very important. We're working with a headwind. It's not just that we have to help people understand this. We have to help them understand it in a context in which they're constantly hearing disinformation. They're constantly hearing things that are designed to make them be in doubt about the science. And so the book and the movie Merchants of Doubt by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway is a very good synopsis of this whole disinformation campaign question. And there are many other books that have been written about this. So one of them is Climate Cover-Up, a couple of books by Ross Gelbspan, The Heat is On. And so lots has been written on the subject of the disinformation campaign. And I would just urge people to take a look at that, to be aware of it, not to let it get us down. We got to keep fighting, but we do have this headwind. So what else as far as the international perspective? The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change does these great assessments. They haven't always been that great at communicating them. They tend to be pretty technical, but I'm trying to advise them a little bit these days, and I'm hoping that they're going to do a better job at communicating more effectively. And that's an organization that's under the auspices of the United Nations. So it's a good venue for international communication if we can get them to continue to step up their game on communication. Also, the World Meteorological Organization, with which I sometimes consult, and where I published that article about unnatural disasters, the linkages between extreme weather and climate change, is another global organization that is a good venue for that kind of communication. But, in different countries, I think there are certainly different issues. And frankly, I work pretty much 24/7 and have for 25 years just focused on this issue in the US. So if I were to try and take on the rest of the world, I don't know what would become of me. I don't think it would be possible. But I think that there probably are some really good experts internationally. I know I have some colleagues at the European Climate Foundation that do a lot of work in Europe on this issue. Tom Brooks, Tim Nuttall are a couple of them. There are people in other countries that are really taking the lead and trying to do more. So if I can help anybody by putting them in touch with people that I know, I'd be happy to try and do that. I also have some colleagues in Australia, for example, that do this kind of work.
Great. I'm going to give you a couple of more questions. For those of you who have posted questions, I see that we have a few listeners who have questions on a related topic of how to deal with politics and politicians, but I'm going to come back to that one. So don't anyone feel that I'm ignoring your question. So we're going to try for two more questions in the next 10 minutes. One is an interesting one. I'll read it. Do you believe religion makes some people question climate change? For example, some religions disagree with modern science topics such as evolution. Could religious beliefs influence a person's view on climate change?
It's a really good question. I think there's been a sense that it might, but I also see that a lot of religious people are taking up the mantle of climate change. There are religious organizations, quite a few of them, that are doing a lot on climate change. One of my colleagues is a climate scientist, Catherine Hayhoe, who's also an evangelical Christian. And she speaks to those people who share her faith, as does John Schellenhuber, another climate scientist who's an evangelical Christian. Sally Bingham is the head of a group called Interfaith Power and Light. And they are an interfaith group of lots of different religions that have come together to take action on climate change. And there are quite a few others. There's the Catholic Climate Covenant, which is a group of Catholics who are working together on climate change. So even though we might think that there are some people who might reject basic science and reject the science of climate change because of their religious faith, there are also religious people who are taking action on climate because of their religious faith, because their religious faith teaches them to take care of God's creation. And they call this creation care, and to take care of the least of these. And because we know that climate change will affect those who are most vulnerable, the people who don't have the ability to adapt and who are living in precarious situations in very vulnerable places. So while I think it may be true that for some people, religion is causing them to maybe doubt climate change, for many others, religion is a cause to embrace action on climate change. And the organizations that I've mentioned are all working in that direction. So I like to hope that there does not have to be a conflict between science and religion. And I think for many people there is not. One of my colleagues, Greg Fischel, he's a TV meteorologist. He says he sees science as sort of an expression of God, that it's the way God reveals his creation to us is through science. And so I think there are a lot of different ways of looking at this. And I, of course, know the people who are working hard from a religious perspective. And so I think that for those who do doubt, there are places they can go and people they can listen to who will be trusted messengers and trusted voices for them because they share common ground, they share religious values. And if they're open to listening, then that's really important. The elite cues, what their leaders are telling them is very important. So hopefully more of those leaders will become convinced of the importance of climate change as a moral issue, like the Pope has been making the case for.
Thanks. We have about 5 minutes left of our audiovisual time, and I'm going to try to wrap these last 3 questions into what has been a theme of your talk. And then if we do have time at the very end, we'll come back to a little bit more in the way of announcements for going forward in this series. So these questions all have to do with, well, first of all, let me thank one person who says, I'm a physician working with the Medical Societies Consortium. Yay, go Dr. Mahoney. Wanting to know how to tailor health impact messages differently based on partisanship. Related to that is how do we correct course with politicians and the relationship with the green movement in politics. And then there's a conflict of interest related question about how do you reach out to those in power who don't want to hear because they are political contributors, don't want them to take up the mantle.
Oof. Those are hard, but I'm going to try. The last one it may be one of the most difficult questions because it's a question of money in politics. And as long as our campaign finance system is what it is, that influence is very powerful and it's very difficult to fight. On the other hand, I think that by appealing to other issues, other concerns, other benefits, by making local appeals so that people, if these politicians come to understand that their constituents really care about this, I think it's going to be difficult for them to just continue to take that fossil fuel money and work against the interests of their own constituents. So this is about getting people to speak up and speak out and call their leaders and let them know that this matters to them and that they care about it. So I think the people still have some power. It's definitely problematic. I think we've got to take it beyond the green movement, and there are Republicans. There's a new coalition. They call it the Noah's Ark Coalition in the House because it's a coalition of, I think there's a dozen Republicans and a dozen Democrats. And if you're a Democrat and you want to join, you got to get a Republican to join with you. So it's a pairs only of Republicans and Democrats, so it's an even number. And they are starting to take some action. And they just recently voted down some legislation that was really anti-climate. And so we're starting to see some leadership from a handful of Republicans in the House. I think we have to really encourage those efforts. And if you know any of those people, let them know that you really appreciate what they're doing, because we need to start breaking this partisan logjam. And there are a handful of people out there who are really trying to do that. Did I miss something?
No, I think we're good.
Okay.
We have one more question that I'm not going to pose to you in the interest of time, and I'm going to let it just float out there, and maybe we can address it on our website, and if you want to weigh in, because probably we could spend an hour on it. So I'm just going to float this last question, and then I'm going to turn it back over to Kathleen for some of the mechanics. But before I do that, I just want to again say our incredible thanks to you, Susan Joy Hassel, for being with us and enlightening us and lifting our sense of what we can do in this arena.
Thank you all for your attention.
You're welcome.
It was my pleasure to talk to you.
So with that, the question that came in was around the language of climate change versus global warming. And the questioner says, I seem to see a trend back in the direction of global warming. And do we think that climate change, though, is the more effective terminology? So I know you probably would love to jump at that. And we will certainly welcome you to do so in writing, but in that we're probably going to get cut off within a minute. I'm going to, like I said, just leave it hanging out there. And I'm going to turn it back to Kathleen again for some announcements about going forward. But thank you again so much.
My pleasure.
Thanks.
And just to wrap up, please tell your friends and colleagues to register for our upcoming webinars. Next week, it's Climate Change Planning Tools, featuring Michael McCormick from the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, Meredith Millett from California Department of Public Health, Matt Wolf from San Francisco Department of Public Health, and Michael Kent from Contra Costa Health Services. Thank you very much. We'll talk to you all next week.